So this video is a little bit different. It's called How I Manage My Phobia of Needles as a Medical Interpreter. So yes, I do have a phobia of needles. Yes, I work around needles a lot. And yes, I am aware that my lip is pierced. So what is a phobia? A phobia is, and this is the definition from Hopkins Medicine. I liked this definition over some of the other ones. A phobia is an uncontrollable, irrational, and lasting fear of a certain object, situation, or activity. This fear can be so overwhelming that a person may go to great lengths to avoid the source of this fear. One response can be a panic attack, and this is a sudden, intense fear that lasts for several minutes. It can happen when there is no real danger. I don't think as an adult I've ever had a panic attack while getting my blood drawn or while getting a shot or anything like that, but I've definitely come close. And so I didn't like a lot of the other definitions of phobias because it just made it seem like phobias are these completely unreasonable things that, why would anyone be afraid of these things? So I don't really consider my phobia to be unreasonable, and I think you'll be inclined to agree with me after watching this video. And phobias are different from fears. So I have a phobia of needles. I have a fear of spiders. Please don't come at me with a spider. Just don't do that. But I get two very different reactions when I'm exposed to needles versus when I'm exposed to spiders. When I'm exposed to spiders, if I see a spider across the room, I'll be like, ew, I hope that thing doesn't get near me. Or if someone were to actually put a spider on my hand, I'd be like, get it off of me. Okay. When I see needles, I don't have a gut reaction to seeing a needle. But once that needle goes into someone's arm, especially the inside of someone's arm, like they're getting their blood drawn, needles in eyes, I think that's just gross. But needles in any other area of the body, like when I get my TB skin tests done, those don't really bother me. It's when needles are actually going into flesh, but typically flesh where there's veins and stuff like that. So lip ring didn't really bother me that much. I definitely had to sit for a little while when they gave me my lip piercing, but and I also chose to get it done. I think that's another difference too. So phobias are often they can be very specific. So in terms of why I have a phobia. So I was born with an inactive thyroid. So my thyroid, that organ in my neck that controls a lot of different hormones, it, as far as I know, hasn't worked since I was born. I was confirmed with blood work at 6 weeks old. And ever since then, if you work in the medical field or you are a medical interpreter, you've likely interpreted for patients with hypothyroidism, sometimes even hyperthyroidism. And those patients have to get their blood drawn to check their thyroid hormone levels. And as you grow, your thyroid hormone levels change. Our hormones change based on different situations, based on our life, based on our age and things like that. And so now I don't get my blood checked as often as I did as a child. I get it done usually once every 6 months unless my lab levels are off. But when I was a child, I would get it done quite a lot. And my medication was constantly changing. And so as I'm sure you can imagine, as a young child getting poked and prodded and pricked all the time, I had people hold me down when I was younger, which I definitely don't recommend doing that to children because that can be very, very traumatic. I am living proof of that. I've had situations where, I've very little, I would run away, and I would scream and I would cry, and sometimes people would stick me up to 10, 20 times. I think once I got stuck, and I'm a very easy blood draw. I'm not sure if you can see, but I'm very pale, so my skin is basically transparent. And I'm always very, very good about drinking lots of water before I get my blood drawn. Staying warm is another thing too. If it's really cold out and I'm not bundled up, that can definitely affect how my blood draw goes. So I'm really easy to draw on. So there was really no excuse for people to be sticking me like, seriously, I think I was 15 and I was held down. Someone pried my arm open, both arms open actually. And, I got at least on each arm like 10 different times. So as I'm sure you can imagine, that was very traumatic for me growing up. And to this day, I have a phobia of needles. And I was very rarely met with compassion or empathy when I expressed that I was scared or I was nervous. And people were often quite insensitive, quite forceful. So I just want to say to anyone in medicine, including medical interpreters, this is why compassion in healthcare is so important. You never know the impact that you can have on someone just by not being compassionate, by being insensitive. You don't even need to be insensitive, just not compassionate. So a lot of different reasons why I have a phobia, all kind of wrapped up in that nice bag of baggage. So in terms of how I feel when I'm faced with needles, I can't see photos of needles in arms, like I mentioned before. Like I said, I can see a picture of a needle. You can hold a sewing needle up in front of me, and I'm like, okay, cool, it's a sewing needle. You can even hold like a piercing needle or even a syringe with a needle. At that point, I might start getting a little anxious seeing one, thinking like, oh, that kind of guttural reaction of, oh, it's medical. Okay. Now, in terms of other people, seeing other people get their blood drawn, things like that, that can be challenging for me, which is, of course, a real challenge being a medical interpreter. I'm often there with patients, and I'm an in-person interpreter, so I'm often there right next to patients when they're about to get a blood draw, or if they're about to go under surgery and they insert an IV, I have to look away. Definitely can't do those injections. I can stay in the room, but I can't look when they give patients those injections in their eyes when they're about to have eye surgery. That's one of those things. I don't even think that's part of my phobia. I think that's just eye stuff grosses me out. But I definitely don't feel the way I do when I am faced with a needle. If I have to get a blood draw or I need to get an injection. Actually, funny story, I got my blood drawn this morning. And I'll explain to you kind of the process, how it played out for me. So first, I wake up in the morning and I already know it's the day that I have to get my blood drawn. Yesterday, I was already nervous a little bit too. Today, I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, I do not want to get out of bed. I'm like that some mornings anyways, but this morning it was really like, I have to force myself to get out of bed. And then before my appointment, I actually had to spend a decent amount of time in the restroom because my stomach was very, very upset. So it's more like a physiological reaction for me. It's not, what a lot of people think, like overreacting and, screaming and acting like the world's going to end. A lot of it's very internal. And I felt nauseous. I also have this tendency to, because I want to make sure I'm well hydrated, I overdrink water before I get my blood drawn. So I will be chugging lots and lots of water, and sometimes I'll even feel nauseous, to the point of feeling nauseous because I'm drinking so much water, because I want to make sure that I'm well hydrated for my blood draw. And then on the way to the clinic to get my blood drawn, I felt nauseous in the car. And getting there to the clinic, there was a long wait before I got my blood drawn. That I felt like I couldn't breathe. And my husband, I always make sure he comes with me when I get my blood drawn, because I want someone to be there to advocate for me if necessary. Because I've certainly been in situations where people have done things without my permission, without my consent, And I can't, sometimes when I get to that point, when I'm in the room and you're about to draw my blood, I can't speak. I get what I call kitten strength, where if you ask me to lower the arm of the chair that you're going to draw my blood on, I can't physically lower the arm. I have a hard time sometimes making a fist for them to draw my blood because I'm so weak. And it's very difficult for me to express myself a lot of the times. And so my husband, because he's been there with me quite a few times, he knows what works best for me. He knows we kind of have a talk beforehand about like what the plan is, what to do when, what to do if. And the number one thing, and two big things actually, are I don't like to lay down when I get my blood drawn. It makes me feel more vulnerable. Whereas when you're in a seated position, your stomach is kind of close to your legs. You're closer to that fetal position. So I feel more comfortable. But that's not the same with everyone else. Another thing too is people tend to over-explain what they're doing. And this can actually trigger me. This can set me off. And when I say set me off, I'm not screaming or, flailing or passing out or anything like that. I've only ever come close to passing out, I think, once. But I do get very faint. I get very weak. I get even paler than I am currently. Probably about as pale as this coffee cup. It's my favorite coffee place, lamplighter. So when it's time for them to draw my blood, if they put the when they put the tourniquet on my arm, if the tourniquet is on way too tight, I feel even more anxious. And oftentimes it's a matter of just kind of putting my nose to the grindstone and just really trying to push through it, because I do feel very faint. I feel like I can't think. I feel nauseous. It's not pleasant. And I don't want to feel that way. It's not like I'm trying to provoke this response in my body. So that's what it feels like for me, what my phobia feels like when I'm faced with needles. So if I'm faced with needles when I'm interpreting, it doesn't bother me as much as when I'm physically getting blood drawn on myself. But the closer I am to the needles, the closer I am, and I also have a thing with veins, and I think that has a lot to do with the needles. I don't have a phobia of veins. It just reminds me of needles, and if I think too much, if I get too much in my head, that can really affect me. So while I'm interpreting, I usually, of course, I look away. So if you're an interpreter and you have, let's say, you have a thing with blood, a phobia of blood, or you don't even have a phobia, you just feel weak at the sight of blood. One, you might have a phobia. Two, because that's how I feel when it comes to getting my blood drawn or shots a lot of the time. Which is really funny because during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was super a huge advocate of the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines for medical interpreters, because a lot of us weren't getting them, unfortunately, because, well, that's a whole other story and a whole other video. But, while I'm interpreting, I usually look away, and sometimes, especially if they're loudly narrating what they're doing to the patient, or if the patient themselves, if they're anxious or if they're nervous, I empathize too much in those situations. And I usually try to do some sort of visualization. I might picture my toes or my feet in sand at the beach and, the five senses. Feel the sand beneath your feet or between your toes. You can see the sand. You can hear the sound that the sand makes, things like that, or the sound of the waves in the background. But my favorite thing to visualize for quite some time, in any situation where I felt uncomfortable or afraid or anxious, I would imagine my cat, Kaida, and his fluffy little face, and petting his little cheeks, and how his little fluffy little cheeks, like right here, right next to his mouth, felt under my hand. Unfortunately, my cat actually, we had to put him to sleep in February. He had advanced kidney disease and some other health problems. He was 15 years old. So for a while there, I was really struggling because every time I would think of my cat, I found myself interpreting for this surgery assignment. And while I was sitting there interpreting and looking away while this patient was getting their IV inserted, I started to think of my kitty cat's little fluffy cheeks and petting them. And I felt, instead of feeling relief and calm and tranquility, I felt this deep sense of loss. And I'm still working through that, and it's better now. So I'm glad that I'm going to be able to get that back, but I'm also kind of afraid of, as time goes on, forgetting how his fur feels and forgetting all of those things. So if anyone has any suggestions for additional visualizations, very, very vivid ones, aside from the feet in the beach sand, I would love to hear those. But when I am getting my blood drawn, I need something a little more that engages my brain a little bit more. I find that I need to have something to kind of process cognitively. Otherwise, the kind of runaway thoughts of thinking about what's going on kind of take over, and I get really anxious and I might start hyperventilating. Sometimes I do cry. Yes, I'm going to be totally upfront with that. Sometimes I do cry, and I'm not sobbing. I just have tears rolling down my face because I just feel paralyzed by fear, by these physical sensations that I have. So there are a couple of things that I do. And I've definitely tried a lot of different things over the years. I used to sing Hakuna Matata, but I think it wasn't engaging enough for my brain. And I would kind of just go, Hakuna Matata, Hakuna Matata, Hakuna Matata. But not out loud like that. I would come, Hakuna Matata, Hakuna Matata. But what I've started doing, and I actually came up with a new one today. We didn't get to try it. But something that I found out, I think this was during the pandemic, was I would look at a piece of text and I would spell it out in Spanish. So if I spell in English, I can do it like way too fast. Like so fast, it's like I'm not even thinking. So that wouldn't work. But when I do it in Spanish, I am a Spanish interpreter. Spanish is not my native language. And I can definitely spell in Spanish with no problem. But in that moment where I'm super anxious, it's like my brain has to work harder. And so spelling things out in Spanish actually helps really distract me and keep my mind occupied. So looking at my notes here, if I were to spell out loud in Spanish, I'd go Howdwif. So I would spell out what I see and just do that. And of course, I get a little bit louder when I'm really anxious. But I did it today and it worked really well. It did not help that the person who was drawing my blood was like, "Is that Spanish?" and then started saying the alphabet in Spanish. And so imagine trying to spell something out in one language or spell something out and someone else is saying a bunch of letters. It's kind of like when you're trying to remember numbers and someone tells you a whole bunch of numbers. Speaking of numbers, the other strategy that I came up with was, and I told my husband to be prepared for this. Like I said, we try and have a game plan before we go in, was tell me a random number between 1 and 99. Random number. And keep on telling me random numbers, but give me an opportunity to say that number in French. So, if you don't know this, French is my second language. However, I like to imagine, and maybe I can put a meme up on the video, the Spanish holding the French hostage in my brain, because that's basically what happens. I can't really speak French anymore, but I can still do my numbers and some simple things. And so, for those of you who don't know about counting in French, once you get to 60, 70 is 70-10. And so 79 would be 60-19. So 79. 60 is 60, 19 is 19. And then once you get to 80, it's 80. 4 20s. 4 20s. So 99 is 4 20s and 19. Yeah. So you got to do a little bit of math. 99. So I thought that would be a good one too. So something that engages your brain, but doesn't engage your brain too much to the point like math problems. I probably wouldn't be able to do those. I mean, except for French math. That's different for some odd reason. But like, or doing long division or something. It's just so complex. Of course, long division isn't difficult, but just comparatively, it's more complex. And what I do find happens with me is if I'm doing something more complex, I get caught up on the fact that I can't do it, or I might struggle, or I might falter. And then that actually makes me more anxious. So different strokes for different folks, different strategies work for different people, but those are some of the strategies that work for me. Now, I'd like to mention some additional strategies that other people have suggested that have not worked for me. So the number one suggestion that I always get is exposure therapy. I'm sorry, but I'm done with that suggestion. So exposure therapy is this idea that the more you're exposed to something, especially if it's something you're afraid of, the less afraid of it you're going to eventually be. I do not at all find that to be the case. I've likely had my blood drawn hundreds of times in my life, if not, I don't know, that's kind of dramatic saying like over 1,000, but definitely hundreds of times I've had my blood drawn. If exposure therapy were going to help me, it would have helped me. And also, I have migraines and I have gone through all sorts of treatments, and the only treatment that has worked for me has been the monthly injectables, the CGRPs. So every month, my husband has to inject me with my migraine medication right in the butt. So I've definitely gotten better with the migraine injections, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. However, that has not helped me at all with getting my blood drawn. So exposure therapy only goes so far, and then I put a bad word there. Exposure therapy only goes so far, comma, bad word. I have strong feelings about that one. Now, medication. Folks have suggested, well, why don't you just take like an anti-anxiety medication or something? Yeah. I have actually broken my nose. And when I was getting my nose relined, they informed me that I was going to have to get a series of injections in my nasal cavity, starting around here and then going all the way up into my nose because the break was right here. Of course, needles in your nose, needles in your face. No one wants that. And so I said, listen, I have a phobia of needles. And, I felt really cheated when I found out that someone had this done and they were anesthetized. I would have really liked that. That would have been great. Because that was arguably one of the top 2 most painful experiences I've ever had in my life, having the injections, not the realignment itself. But they prescribed me a very strong anti-anxiety medication. It was like 1 pill that I had to take before it. And I felt really calm, got into the room. And the second they started injecting me in my nose, I started freaking out. So it's anti-anxiety medications like that, at least for me, only work up until the moment that the thing's about to happen. So if I'm agonizing for a long time before it, sure, but it's not going to help me during the actual thing. And then another thing that people have suggested, and this definitely came a lot when I was a kid, was positive reinforcement. Try and pair the negative thing with a positive thing. Okay, well, if your daughter's going to get her blood drawn, why don't you take her out to the store and get her a toy? Or take her out for ice cream before or after? So I still do this for myself. I got my coffee. I haven't had this coffee in quite some time. It's very good. Also got myself a cookie. Oh, wait, I still have a little bit of the cookie. Oh, I forgot about that. But yeah, okay, so it makes me feel better afterwards. I'm not going to be able to enjoy it before. In fact, having caffeine like this beforehand is probably not a good idea. My anxiety is all gone now. But yeah, that didn't really work. As a kid, my mom tried buying me a toy before, buying me a toy after, or worse yet, buying me a toy only if I didn't cry, which that was really hard. Didn't really work either. And my mom kind of realized it and stopped kind of doing the thing where she's like, well, if you don't cry, I'm going to get you a toy. But if you cry, you're not getting a toy. I would never get a toy. And I would tell my mom, I can't help it. I can't stop it. And I really couldn't. And I still can't when I do. So the kind of last part that I wanted to talk about was what not to say or do to someone with a phobia. So this is unfortunately, and you know what? Listen, I work as a medical interpreter. I work with a lot of healthcare providers. I work with a lot of people who play a lot of different roles in healthcare. And I've met some wonderful people in healthcare. But I've also met, especially through my own personal experiences as a patient, some awful people in healthcare. There are just some people in healthcare who are just god awful. And I understand that the system, I've been there. I used to be, a receptionist basically at a clinic. And I understand, it's tough. I'm glad that it's not as tough on me as an interpreter, especially since I really enjoy what I do. But the stress that you're placed under, you gotta more patients. You have to see a certain number of patients and things. Our healthcare system is designed to burn people out and, create what's called compassion fatigue, where you basically lose your compassion. And I've met a lot of people who've had compassion fatigue. So a lot of my stuff coming from what not to say or do to someone with a phobia comes from this. Meeting a lot of people with no compassion whatsoever. So a lot of these things that I'm going to suggest are personal preference. And you should always, at the very least, try to ask the person. But if the person can't respond to you, I would say just be kind. That's the number one thing. Don't be mean. If someone says that they're afraid of needles or they have a phobia of needles, be kind, be gentle. I oftentimes rehearse phrases that I'm going to say if I get some negative responses. And one of the phrases that I rehearsed today was, sometimes I'll give people gentle suggestions is there any way I can put my arm on this part of the table or do this or do that? And they'll take that as basically me trying to tell them how to do their job. And they'll respond, I've been doing this for 20 years, young lady, you shouldn't tell me what to do, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes people get like that. They get very defensive. And I had this whole planned prepackaged response with, my husband gives me my migraine injection every month. And I don't feel as nervous with my husband as I do with you right now. Because my husband treats me with kindness and compassion. So I had that prepared for today. So it really does make all the difference for me. Personally, I don't see it hurting with anyone. Being mean to someone when they have a phobia, definitely not the way to go. You're probably going to make them react even worse. They're probably going to feel even worse, and you're probably going to contribute further to their trauma. So don't do that, please. Thank you. I once got and this is one of those things that you do not to say to someone with a phobia. I had someone tell me once that it was all in my head. Or any sort of dismissive thing like that. It's all in your head. Why you gotta be afraid of needles? What's your problem? It's all in your head. So's brain cancer. Thanks. Not helpful. You're probably gonna me off. Pardon my French. And you're also going to make me feel more nervous. Because what happens when you get angry? Adrenaline. What makes anxiety worse? Adrenaline. What happens when you're anxious? A lot of times adrenaline. So you're just contributing to that neurochemical thing that's going on in my brain. Don't get frustrated or impatient. And I know this one's really hard. I acknowledge this 100%. If you feel rushed, if you have bajillion patients on your schedule, you're like, oh, I'm supposed to pump these people out in like 5 minutes and you're taking forever, blah, 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 blah. I won't take forever. I really won't. I can be pretty quick. As long as you're kind, you're patient, you're not frustrated with me, it'll be over real quick. Because the worse you treat me before you draw my blood, the more likely it is that I'm going to feel weaker after you draw my blood. And I'm going to be unable to move, unable to talk, and then I'm going to have to sit in your chair for longer. So it's a give and take kind of thing. So do have patience. Even if you're short on time, try your very, very best. Just take a breath. I promise I'm far more anxious than you are. And just do your stuff and be kind. Also, too, don't give advice. A lot of the things that people suggest is kind of like the things that people suggest when I have migraines. I've been to 5 different neurologists. I have been through 15 plus years of trying to get treatment for my migraines. I've tried a lot of stuff. So saying, have you tried vitamins? Anger, that's where that anger is going to come in. And yes, you can feel anger when you're anxious. It's not a good combination. I really don't think advice is a good thing to do. And also, too, if my husband comes to me with something that's upsetting him, like something that happened to him or whatever, and he wants to talk to me about it, the one very, very important lesson I've learned is a lot of times he doesn't want me to give him solutions or to work through it logically with him. He wants to vent. So just let the feelings be. Don't try to fix them. Just let them be and be kind. And then another thing too and the reason why I make sure to always tell people before I get my blood drawn, yes, I have a phobia of needles. No, I do not pass out, is because the second I start feeling faint, looking weak, or if I don't mention that I don't pass out, people will act like the world is ending. They will pull out a cushion or forcibly move me over to a table and lay me down. I once had a woman try and push my head down because I was getting pale. Forcibly pushed my head down without my consent, and that of course made me far more nervous, made me angry that someone was physically moving my body without my consent. Treat things very matter-of-factly. Okay, you don't pass out, okay. And I know it's tough with like medical liability and stuff. You definitely don't want someone passing out on you. But is there a note in their chart? I've been going to my same doctor for a long time. And I know for a fact that in the EHR system that they use, the electronic health record management system that they use, there's the ability to put an alert on a patient account. And we used to always put alerts on patient accounts that said, patient experiences syncope during blood draws, or, patient fainted on X date during a blood draw. Those are things that people need to know, obviously. But if I'm telling you, and I've been going to this place for a long time, and no alert or anything in my chart, there probably isn't any reason for you to think that I'm gonna pass out, because who knows me better than me? And sometimes people will be like, are you sure? Don't you want to lay down? As I've explained before, I don't like to lay down because it makes it worse for me. It makes me feel more vulnerable. And again, that just brings it back to everyone's different. Some people might prefer to lay down if they have a phobia of needles. So I bring all of this up. The whole reason why I made this video is because this is something that has come up repeatedly in a lot of the medical interpreting forums that I manage on Facebook. Interpreters who have issues with potentially phobia, maybe not a phobia, with needles, blood, things like that. Because sometimes, as medical interpreters, we do see a lot of things and experience a lot of things very closely. And so we need to be prepared for those things, and we need to have strategies for managing those things. So I shared this video to give you some strategies to manage, to let you know that phobias are real. They're not something that people just make up because they want attention. No, I do not want attention. That's the very last thing that I want. I just want to be low key. I want to get in, I want to get out, and I want to go on with my day. That's it. So also, like I said, some strategies to work through if you are feeling that way while you're interpreting. But also, too, to encourage everyone to just have compassion. Whether you're a healthcare interpreter, whether you work in healthcare, honestly, whether you're just a human being going around in the world, a little bit of compassion goes a long way. So please, be compassionate, be kind, have patience. And on that note, I'm going to call an end to this video, so be sure to like and subscribe. And also, too, if you check out my Ko-Fi, if you like the videos that I post, I actually do have a Ko-Fi where you can leave me a tip. I even have membership options as well. Like and subscribe. Check out my Ko-Fi. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye. A big reason I started my channel was because I noticed a lot of educational and practice materials for interpreters were expensive and inaccessible. I don't know about you, but I think interpreters should have equal opportunities to access quality, enriching education, whether they're based in the US or outside of it, interpreting remotely, or in person. Because at the end of the day, the more of these opportunities we give interpreters, the better we're all able to serve the marginalized communities we interpret for, right? So that's what my channel is all about in a nutshell. If you'd like to support my mission to create more accessible educational opportunities for interpreters, check out my Ko-Fi at ko-fi.com/KGH interpretation. Thanks for watching.